Academia functions exactly the way it's supposed to. If you have a problem with it, then the problem is with you, not the system. People make criticisms of school and university all the time, and increasingly so recently. But where do these criticisms come from? What are they really saying, and how valid are they? There's two major perspectives or sides you can take as to the discourse around academia today, and both have largely mismatched initial perspectives, which is where the conflict comes from in the first place. On the one hand, you can take the position of someone who values the school system and authority and legitimacy very highly, and they measure validity through legitimacy from the schooling system. So this is your kind of standard paradigm. You'll see this with older people or people that are like deep into academia, so people doing like PhDs and master's degrees and things like this. So the established system is that legitimacy or authority in a field, like if you were going to go into a job or speak about something on TV or something like that, authority comes from essentially the big daddy, you know? So whether that be a degree, when you're earlier in school, that's going to be like the teacher. So the teacher telling you, oh, good job, little boy. Or later it'll be like the professors peer reviewing your work or whatever. The other perspective is the kind of new age academia and school system critics. So this is kind of an old example, but think of like your Andrew Tates. They'll talk about why school doesn't do X, Y, Z, or how school is inefficient or trains you to be whatever. And a key thing to note about these people is that they think they're going against the grain because the basic like established culture is that of like the paradigm of the one we were talking about before, the kind of authority, and school gives you authority and legitimacy, etc. But actually they're not really going against the grain, because this is quite a big position in and of itself now. Like it's a very legitimate, valid take, and a very common one that people have, which is why it's even worth talking about. So these people are not actually being as clever or against the grain as they think they are. Okay, so now I've kind of painted the picture of what the two sides are here. What is the big picture that we're going to try and analyze in more detail. But first, we need to be more precise about exactly the claim that we're going to analyze. And at the start of the video, I said that the school system functions exactly as it's supposed to, and if you have a problem with it, then the problem is with you. So I'm going to do the analysis from that lens. Okay, and the reason that I lean towards that as a perspective is something very simple. If you actually assess academia and you look at academia within the last 20, 30, 100 years, it really hasn't changed. It looks exactly the same. People use this as a criticism sometimes. So why that's important is because the system hasn't changed for 20, 30, 100 years, but the perspective of the system clearly has. I don't think there's any argument there. People definitely have a different outlook as to how useful or how good or important higher education or university or academia is. So then pretty obviously, if the system itself has remained the same, but the perspective has changed, then where we need to look in more detail is not at the system itself, because the system hasn't changed. What's the point in looking at the system? We know the system, it's established. Where we need to instead focus our attention is what has changed with the people who have the perspectives, right? So we need to look at individuals, people, society, whatever, and anything else that may have changed within this time period. And then to actually make this realization useful, we need to look at, instead of society as a whole, the individual. Because you as the individual don't have power to change the structure of the system of academia anyway. It's pointless doing an analysis of the structure of academia. And sure, you could do a criticism of how academia functions and what it teaches you and what it should teach you, but you're not going to be able to change that. That's just entertainment. No one really cares enough about that analysis to do something about it. Someone could do something about it if you really cared enough. Perhaps you run for some political position and then you actually make changes. But none of you watching right now care enough about this as an issue to actually do something about it. You care about it so far that it involves or affects you as an individual. There are very many valid criticisms that someone could make of the school systems as it affects you as an individual. The main ones you'll actually hear all are kind of filtered through this entrepreneurial lens. So, I mean, the kind of classic drop out of school or university, become an entrepreneur, start a business, create something, and then generate wealth doing that, and essentially buy your freedom. That's like the classic, that's essentially what people are talking about, right? Entrepreneurship is just modern language. What we're really talking about here is autonomy. When you're an entrepreneur, if you're a successful entrepreneur anyway, then you have time and freedom to make your own decisions. Okay, school conditions you to be a worker. That is so obvious and clear. I'm not denying that in the slightest. But the thing is, school has always conditioned you to be a worker. Not trained you, by the way. This is a key distinction. It doesn't train you to be a worker, it conditions you to be a worker. It conditions you to seek validation from a higher source. But it doesn't train you to be a worker in the sense that it trains you to work in a specific career or field. That's a separate video. Subscribe if you want to see that. Okay, and the thing is, people have never had a problem with that before. There's really bad connotations around the word slave. But actually, historically, many slaves throughout history were basically just normal members of society. You can be a slave, but you can be a comfortable slave. That's the point. School trains you to be a worker, sure, but you're a comfortable worker, then you don't care. When someone doesn't have an immediate boot on their neck, they will happily settle for comfort. That's not a criticism, that's not necessarily even a bad thing. If you want to talk about that, that's a completely different discussion, but that's just the fact. So the key shift that you then see is that today, being a well-educated slave is no longer enough to be comfortable. You can have a degree in computer science and still not be able to comfortably afford a house and have loads of children on a societal level or on an individual level. So now the cracks start to show. Now people start to question, what is the purpose of this thing? Why am I here? How good actually is it? Okay, the way I see it is that we're in a very transitional period of history right now. University started off as a kind of religious institution that mainly wealthy people would go into, basically to just learn about the world. That's essentially what it was for most of its history. If we zoom in on a very specific part of the history of university or academia, and we look at maybe 50, 60 years ago, your parents' or grandparents' generation, which is why it's relevant, we see this shift in university of being related to careers specifically. People don't understand that that link didn't exist before this. If you wanted to work, if you wanted to do a job, you just did the job. If you wanted to go to university, that meant you were just learning. What we're experiencing right now is simply the transition out of that period. Now we're in a kind of awkward middle ground where from this 50, 60 year period, there's still this kind of setup of the degree to career path that still exists, but also it's becoming less and less relevant and more competitive because degrees are far less valuable than they've ever been before. And this is where my perspective seems to be quite a natural conclusion because, and someone commented on this, on my previous video, by the way, saying that doing a degree to not get a job is a privileged and stupid take. And I'm going to double down on it right now. Because yes, academia is no longer optimized for career. That's so clear and obvious for anyone to see. If you actually do a degree in a traditional field like STEM or humanities or the arts, etc., you will see that clearly, like, what are you doing in a day-to-day of a degree? Like, you're not writing citations and research papers for the fucking fun of it. You're clearly being trained to be in academia. You're doing an undergraduate degree and they're training you how to survive in the world of academia to do a master's and then a PhD. That is the way they design it. And if you want to hear more about that last point, then subscribe to stay tuned because I have a full video dedicated to specifically that. But I guess to conclude, all I'm actually saying is academia has stayed pretty consistent for like the last 100, 200 years. It just so happened that at one point in history, getting a degree meant a pretty stable and comfortable life. Before that point, it never meant that. And today, it's increasingly looking like that's no longer the case. That is about it. The system hasn't really changed. You have. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like it so that more people can see it and the discussion grows. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you and have a nice day.